It was about 8:30 p.m. While taking out the trash at work with a co-worker and roommate, a large dog approached us. It seemed to be galloping. It wasn't walking normally, like an animal should. Despite the many surrounding lights, the dog appeared to be entirely black. It was silhouetted just enough that you could see its muscle definition. I could see a slight reflection in its eyes. It seemed to lack a shadow. My roommate and I both expressed having different experiences and visions of the dog. When I initially saw the dog, I interacted saying, "Oh, dog," in excitement. For me, it proceeded to sit entirely still on the cement, staring like a statue. What I saw was a large, fluffy black dog, lazy ears, similar to a Newfoundland dog. My roommate expresses seeing the dog as a large, very muscular, aggressive looking black dog that stood rigid the entire time, staring like it wanted to attack. It was short haired, muscled, and had pointed ears. I jokingly stated that the dog looked like a skinwalker, not really anticipating that anything could happen. Then, we immediately felt a wake of dread fall over us. Something was wrong. We both saw the dog's jaw open, almost as if it was about to bark. We heard a distant yet extremely clear, high-pitched, "Come here!" The dog immediately turned to take off. We turned around the corner. The creature was unreasonably far up the road for the short amount of time that it was not being observed. It was wobbling, crossing its paws, walking oddly. When it turned left around a corner, it seemed to nearly stand up on its hind paws, walking on two legs, just before passing around out of sight. The rest of the night was just as interesting. We had trouble with certain objects in slightly moving places, nudging a bit, settling. It quickly became more aggressive. But then, just as we were about to leave, we heard a loud and persistent knocking coming from the front of the store. We quickly went to our cars. On the drive home, I tried to blast music and ignore what I had just seen. I heard whispering coming from my back seat. I couldn't quite make out any words. It just sounded like whistling, almost. But get this. I saw a random antique clawfoot bathtub on the left side of the road, in a field. It was certainly not there the day before, or even that morning on my drive there. The kicker? I was watching the sidelines of the roads for animals, and I almost certainly saw a buck. He was leaping out in front of the road, a good 50 feet ahead. I slammed on my brakes, but when I got closer, it was merely a bush. Perhaps I was just paranoid, but this is all very concerning. I'm sometimes visited at night by apparently nothing, but definitely something. To explain, the events occur strictly at night while I'm trying to fall asleep, particularly when my wife is at work. I'll be trying to fall asleep when out of the blue, I feel the blanket compress along my back, as if someone were crawling into bed with me. The sensation progresses from my feet all the way to my neck, where it just stops. I can feel the compression of the blanket for as long as I stay still, but if I roll over or climb out, it goes away, usually for the night, but it does return on rare occasions. I feel no hostility from whatever it is, and it does feel particularly female, though I have no idea why. I have no reason to think it's female aside from my gut feeling telling me it is. I have no dead lovers. I don't think it's sleep paralysis. When it happens, I become 100% lucid with full control over my body. I also always open my eyes when this happens, and I've never seen anything, even when I've gotten the nerve to roll over and face whatever it was. This has happened to me for at least the last 6 years, but possibly longer. My family and I did previously live in an apartment that was very haunted, and the driving force for our leaving was several instances of finding scratches on our infant son in the morning, and knowing he couldn't have scratched himself through his pajamas. The thought of something having attached itself to myself or my wife seriously freaks me out, but I know it can happen. Even though I haven't felt any hostility since we left the apartment, It still freaks me out. What if it's the same entity just biding its time? I just don't know. And that's the worst of it. My old apartment was haunted. My wife and I both had separate experiences in that house. I can't speak to all of her experiences, but a few that stood out for me were shortly after we moved in, my wife and I were in bed sleeping during the day, and I heard the sound of a kid saying, "Mommy, mommy, mommy," from her side of the bed. I thought it was my stepson and rolled over to see what he wanted. When I rolled over, I saw a shadow from a child on all fours over the top of my wife. I blinked to clear my eyes of sleepiness, and it was gone. Something you should know about this apartment was that it was a house with two apartments divided between the top floor and bottom floor. I looked at both floors before choosing the bottom floor because it was bigger and had a basement. Anyway, a year or so later, one night I'm getting home from work and I look at the house and see a pale face looking out from the attic window. The upstairs apartment did have tenants at the time, but I know for a fact that the landlord had bolted the attic shut because I asked when I looked at the upstairs apartment. There were numerous other small incidents, the usual footsteps when no one else was around, seeing shadow people out the corner of your eye, random feelings of being watched and dread, but things really escalated when my wife got pregnant. Things started happening around her more often. When her belly started to show, she would sometimes wake up with scratches on it. Once, she swears some unseen force straight up knocked her down. But what really forced us to move was after we had my son. He would have random scratches on his body, and after the first time we found them, we made sure he went to bed with mittens on, because baby fingernails are razor blades in their own right. And we also made sure he was also wearing a onesie to protect him from getting scratched some other way. That was the last straw. We could tolerate the attacks on ourselves, but not the baby. We packed up and moved before his first birthday to a home we bought ourselves. The home is also haunted, but not in the malicious way like the last, and that's another series of tales for the future. As we were leaving, we felt the obligation to warn the new tenants, but didn't want to look crazy either. There was a section of wood panelling in the basement that you could pull off the wall to get access to the water main. I figured that any sufficiently curious renter would eventually pull that panel off to see what's behind it. I did. So I left a note where addressed to the next tenants taped to the inside of the panel, detailing what went on and warning them of what they may encounter. You may call me an ass for not telling them outright, but I didn't feel it was right to potentially scare off any would-be renters, since our landlord was a good person and treated us well. "You can't call me at work," I said. "This is highly unprofessional." "I'm sorry," he said, "but I got something special. Never seen anything like it." Angel wasn't much for hyperbole. He'd done this for years. If he said he'd never seen anything like it, and he's calling me at work about it, it must be special. "I'm listening." "I got a new source. They have something amazing." "Green?" "Of course. That's what you paid me for. I wouldn't risk it." I nodded. I'd never had a problem working with Angel before, and he was usually great at proofing his sources. I'm a collector, not a monster. "What do you have?" "Honestly, I don't have the slightest idea, but I'll bet my ponytail you'll love it." That, if anything, was interesting. Not the ponytail, but the offer. I've always had an interest in the macabre. I feel an amazing sense of control when people talk to me or visit my house, not knowing what I keep in the dark collection room. It makes me feel like I'm stronger and smarter, like a fox among chickens, confidently strutting among them. It brings me the confidence I need to do my job, and it earns me the money to support my lavish lifestyle. I've been collecting for years. It started with leftovers and vestigial parts, milk teeth and tonsils, just these useless little things that were thrown away. A discarded umbilical cord was my first step up. And when I got my first parasitic twin, I was ecstatic. It was all supposed to be discarded and thrown away, but to me, it turned into a wonderful collection. Over the past 15 years, I've expanded into 2 rooms. Shelf after shelf of discarded organs, and enough bones to construct a complete human skeleton with dozens of people. I have 6 different human hearts, 3 brains, and 8 pairs of eyes. Organs who couldn't or wouldn't be donated. Some from the young, some from the old. Some healthy, some sick, some disfigured. I prefer the latter. They make for more interesting pieces. But they have to be green. No grave robbing, no illegal harvesting, nothing unethical. Either willing or dead, and nothing marked for donation. If someone needs that heart, I don't want it. But a pair of eyes with heterochromia from someone who peacefully passed, I have a place for those. I'd honour those. Maybe get a little rotating platform. I didn't just want to have volumes of organs, though. I wanted variety, and most of all, rarity. I worked with a few doctors and morticians over the years, but most were squeamish and uncomfortable. I could rarely get anything, not to mention anything fresh. But a few years ago, I started talking to Angel. Angel works exclusively online. I know he has a vast contact network, but he works mostly in North America, mostly the East Coast, but sometimes in the Midwest. I know he has certain illegal dealings, especially in the high-end wine trade, but he always played it straight with me. He has the proper documentation and can prove to me not only that the organ is what it is, but that the patient is either dead, unharmed, or consenting. Green. As I say it out loud, it sounds so brutal. That's not what this is about. This is about control and that delicious warmth in my chest. It feels like being Clark Kent, knowing that all that stands between you and the complete ruin of everyone around you is social convention, mercy, and a pair of glasses. I got the big S right there. My trophies. That day when Angel called me, I had no idea what to expect. So when I got an email with 20 attached images, my heart was racing. I grabbed a glass of dry white, dimmed the lights, and spun my chair around. It was an unknown patient, dead of blunt force trauma, possibly some kind of traffic accident. No one had claimed the body. No one seemed to know who they were, but this person, this anonymous body, had some really strange features. During the autopsy, Angel's contact reached out to see if we were interested in some lovingly named leftovers. And the pictures they showed me, well, gave me the shivers. I had no idea what I was looking at. Wonderful. It looked like a human organ, but it was either smoke damaged or almost fermented. Less than 6 hours out of the body and almost completely black. It looked like it was wrapped in some sort of seaweed with little barbs holding it all together. I had no idea what I was looking at. And I was already salivating over it. This was going to be preserved and given a proper placing, for sure. They say this is a second heart, the email read. A piggyback heart. A growth added on top of the regular heart to help combat heart disease. But I've never seen anything like it. Those are usually added surgically. This is organic. It has no name. My contact wants to study it, but they're willing to send it off once they've done preliminary scans. Not gonna lie, this'll cost you. It's not damaged. Eucalyptus fresh, green as grass. I had to have it. This was a unique find, as close to mint as I could get. I wanted to know all about it, and I wanted to have this trophy. It deserved my admiration. I didn't even try to play it cool. I knew Angel wouldn't try to rip me off. I just asked him to name his price. Angel got back to me the next day. He hired a courier and assured me the package would be delivered within 36 hours. He sent me more pictures, along with a few links to the accident. Some guy in a raincoat, hit by a truck. Didn't look like much. Angel didn't want to say too much as to not reveal his sources, but it looked legitimate. For an entire day, I was like a kid waiting to open a Christmas present. A genuine, unique type of organ in my collection. I had a few rarities, but this This was different. This could be something new. This would elevate me one step over the other collectors. Of course there were others. What's the point of a collection if you can't brag about it? When I got home, there was this nervous 20-something outside my door tapping her foot. She just handed a cooler over and ran. No confirmation if I was the right person, no code word, no notification, nothing. Angel usually has more professional people. Getting a delivery from sketchy people makes you look sketchy in turn, you know? But I brought it in and opened it. I prepared myself and cut the foam open, still ice cold with vacuum packaging, marked with Hatchet Farmer, like most of Angel's deliveries. Can't miss it with that icy blue plastic wrapper. It's a pain to open though. I put on my gloves and started preparing a preservative jar. I had a few jars that would work while I got something fancier for the showroom. Even though I'd done this literally hundreds of times, I was visibly nervous. My hands were shaking. When I cut the bag open and reached in to grab the organ, I immediately felt a sting on the tip of my finger. The barbs were sharp. Bringing it out into the light, I finally got a better view of it. The thing was bigger than my fist. This was not just a piggy bag heart. This thing was an entire organ in and of itself. It was a dark hazelnut brown with black veins. Some sort of dark green skin flaps covering up the edges. Parts of it had these sharp barbs, some kind of keratin. I've never seen anything like it. I could tell that it had a structure similar to a human heart though. It had clear connections to the pulmonary artery. But this was just a quick look. It looked more like a dragon fruit. It was glorious. I couldn't wait to find out more about it. I gently placed it in the preservative, trying not to prick my fingers again. I was very pleased. My finger hurt a little though. I spent hours in my lounge chair just looking at the thing in the dim light of my collection. A mild teal spotlight casting a sharp contrast. Even with a temporary preservative jar, I had it on a rotating platform so I could see it from every angle. I still couldn't tell what was the right orientation. What was the front and back? It was impossible to tell. It barely looked like, well, anything. I fell asleep in that chair, waking up just past midnight. I shut the lights and got ready for bed. I didn't even think about the ache in my fingertip where the barb had punctured my skin. I fell in and out of sleep all night. I had a fever, and by morning, I didn't know what was real and what wasn't. I'd gotten up to use the bathroom a dozen times, and I was sweating buckets. The sheets were sticking to my body, and I was drooling like an idiot. My feet were wet from sweat, leaving stains across the floor. I barely had the energy to stand, and my balance kept failing me. The only point where I felt truly alive was when I was getting up from the toilet and fell over. My warm cheek against the cold bathroom tiles was the greatest thing I'd felt in years. I managed to crawl into the kitchen. I called in sick for the first time in years and fell asleep leaning against the kitchen island. I kept blinking in and out of consciousness. I probably sat there for a few hours. I woke up with this big chemical-smelling puddle under me, and my robe was covered in mucus. I tried to call for help, but I was too weak to hold the phone. I just remember smearing gross across the screen, and the face recognition just refused to work. I couldn't get a fingertip either. I sat there all morning, just trying to muster the strength to move. I had bouts of panic, thinking I might not ever recover, that this would be it. I would feel my pulse hammering, and I could physically feel my heart moving. Despite my body giving up, my heart was as strong as ever. A bit too strong, it felt like. It hurt like hell. I managed to get some water from the tap, but I couldn't keep it down. I kept slipping and falling over, bruising my knees and elbows. It was a goddamn miracle that I didn't crack my head open. I woke up on the kitchen floor sometime in the afternoon. The sky was grey outside, and I could hear rain smatter against the windows. I managed to sit back up and grab some orange juice from the fridge. Just getting back up on my legs was exhausting, and I found myself wheezing for air. Sitting there, chugging a jug of orange juice, all I thought about was getting through this. My head was starting to clear, but my chest still felt weird. I hadn't even noticed my finger. My entire fingertip was just one big boil that had burst sometime during the day. I managed to stumble into the shower and dump all my clothes into a pile. I was covered in cuts, bruises, and these big discoloured circles on my legs. I looked about as good as I felt, but at least I was back on my legs. Shaky legs, but still. There were still smatterings against my window, but it sounded more intense. I didn't think about it at first. I was just concentrating on staying upright. I cleaned the mess in the kitchen once I felt better. This was probably just some temporary thing that needed to get out of my system. Food sickness, or some kind of bug. I didn't even think about my latest collection piece. I keep those two lives very separate. By the time I stepped out of the shower and into a fresh robe, I kept having these flashes. It was as if the lights were turning on and off. It took me a few seconds to realise it was coming from the window. Looking out, my breath stopped. Something was moving past the window, casting a long shadow across the floor. Then, something else moved. Again and again, big shadows whooshed past the window, their large shadows making the entire room blink. I took a step closer, blinking. For a while, I couldn't see them. It was as if they were there, and at the same time, they weren't. But when they were there in horrifying detail. They were the size of large dogs, these pale, winged, six-fingered beasts. Round, beady eyes, reflecting what little light slipped between the clouds. Like insects flocking to a lamp, they swarmed around my windows, fighting to get a look at me. Carefully, they tried to pull at the window frames, probing for a weakness, a way in. I just stood there, looking at them. It felt like my heart was about to cramp. One of them clung to the window, staring at me, unblinking. I couldn't comprehend it. I just closed my eyes and started hitting my head over and over, like trying to beat the image out of my skull. I groaned in frustration and felt my pulse rise. When I finally opened my eyes again, they were gone. I slowly backed away from the window, as if trying not to knock over a house of cards. As my heart snagged on something, a barbed pain shot through my lungs. At the edge of every heartbeat, they came back into view, blinking in and out of existence. One moment, all I heard was rain. The next, they were clawing themselves in. They were there, and at the same time, they weren't. I needed help, but my phone had run out of battery. I splashed my face with cold water and stepped away to check on my collection. I had to get a closer look at the mystery organ. There was a kinship there, one sick heart to another. It was oozing out of the jar. The preservatives had turned a solid blue, and the organ had swelled. It had doubled in size, and the little barbs had turned long and soft, like tendrils. But the strangest thing was what it had done to the rest of my collection. The other jars were also swelling, some preservatives turning blue, cracking the glass, and dripping onto the floor. As my pulse rose and fell, seemingly at random, I could see flashes of the organ moving. 1 second it was trying to break out to the jar, the next it was just sitting there. Much like the creatures outside, it was both happening and not at the same time. My head was flashing hot and cold, and I could feel my legs buckling. Maybe it was all just a fever. Maybe nothing was wrong. Maybe I was still on the cool bathroom floor. The warmth and cold that pulsed in my head made it hard to stay upright. The floor felt crooked, but I think I might have just been me. I hurried back into my living room. For a moment, it was all quiet. Then, a torrent of sounds, faces, scratching claws and leathery wings slamming against the windows. Then, a heartbeat later, all quiet. Over and over again, it was as if another world tried to beat itself into my mind. Two realities trying to fit into my head at once. Slamming, scratching, screeching. It could go either way. It felt like a part of me was balancing on the edge of a knife, ready to fall one direction or the other. Screech, scratch, slamming against the windows with hopeless abandon. But there was another noise. A voice. Hello. I stepped into the hallway. I could see the shadows from the window behind me come and go with my irregular heartbeats. but there was a strange metallic noise coming from the front door. I turned the corner. There was something standing in my hallway, and a moment later, it wasn't. My door was open and also broken, hanging loose from the bottom hinge. A dark, towering creature. It was there, and not. Large enough that I had to tilt its head to stand upright. With his impossibly long arms and fingers, he held a simple paper bag, dripping with blood. Then, he was gone. My breathing slowed. I just stood there trying to calm down. Everything was fine. Door closed, gentle rain tapping at my windows. Then, the paper bag was held up against my face, the creature looming over me. The winged beasts outside were going crazy. "Give him what he wants," a muffled voice from inside the bag pleaded. "He just wants it back. Please, just give it back to him." I fell backwards, crawling desperately. My sweaty hands slipped on the hardwood floor, scratching my palms and losing traction. It took the creature no more than 2 steps to catch up to me, holding the bag out towards me. "It's not yours to keep," the bag screamed. "You got your own." There was no doubt in my mind. Forcing myself to stand, I crashed into my collection room, knocking over jars and trophy cases, little boxes of teeth, little stands of mummified fetuses. The jar with the strange organ had cracked, leaking a blue, thick fluid onto the floor. It was a mess. It was all just a big, disgusting, chemical mess. I grabbed the organ, feeling the soft barbs, little tendrils, tickling my arm. I stepped back to the large creature and held out the organ. It turned its bag inside out as something soft splattered onto the floor. Something meaty and human with a ponytail. A decapitated head, trying to breathe, opening and closing its mouth like a trout. I dropped the organ in the bag. The next moment, I was alone. A broken collection. Formalin and alcohol running rampant over the floor. My feet barely avoided the broken glass. And just outside, the rain gently tapped against my window. I haven't experienced anything like it since. The floor wasn't crooked, and the door was fine. No scratches on the windows, no bloodstains, no nothing. And still, the organ is gone. I haven't been able to get into contact with Angel. It's like a line was cut, and I haven't heard from him since. Something must have happened. I have my suspicions, but I don't think I can handle that path just yet. It feels like I'm one bad thought away from stepping back into that dark world. Like the winged creatures, still looking for a way in. I was sick for days afterwards, and I looked awful. I've since contacted a medical professional. They found some irregularities with my pulse, and I'm waiting for x-ray results. I don't want to sound too alarmed, but the doctor brought in 3 other people to consult with. I know this story doesn't make me sound all too sympathetic. I'm no saint, and to a lot of people, I guess I come off as a bit of a creep. But if you can just put that aside for a bit and think of me as a human, then please, pray that the results are normal. Living in a second-hand jacket, taught to read by a cokehead abbot. I roam unfree, born in debris, bow down to the subway maggot. Rich was feeling it, so we all felt it. All it takes is one guy to get into the groove for the rest of us to follow suit. My legs were already burning. The subway maggot chorus is by far the most intense part for the drummer. That's why we'd written it in a short break during the solo. As Rich gave way for Cam, I got out of my seat and clapped along with the audience. I felt like a conductor, holding my drumsticks up while Cam was shredding. That's the first time I saw him, the man in the raincoat. In the far back, he was easily 6'5". I had no idea how he wasn't sweating to death in that outfit. It was so warm up front that some of the security guards were spraying people with water bottles. Basement gigs always have shit ventilation. But there he was, in the far back, completely unfazed. I didn't get a good look at him at first, but it was hard to miss in a pulsating sea of leather jackets, denim, and chains. He wasn't moving, just swaying back and forth with the flow of the crowd. black locks of hair hanging from the side of his face. Weird. We finished an encore of Waltz of the Apostate and called it a night. Great gig. Lynn was manning the merch booth with Cam while Rich and I crashed backstage. I picked out a couple of beers from the cooler while Cam checked our socials and our laptop. I was halfway through my second brew when I looked up at Rich. He was watching images from the crowd. "You saw the guy in the black?" I asked. "Raincoat guy?" "Yeah, what was up with that?" Rich frowned. "Man's gotta be sweating buckets." "You think he was a label?" "Could be a label." "Could be, yeah," nodded Rich. "Doubt it, but yeah." I handed him a beer and got a good look at a crowd image on the laptop. Raincoat Man stood out like a sore thumb. Hadn't it been for those big eyes, he would have just looked like a shadow. Damn, big eyes. Before going on tour, we usually have a month of doing local gigs, just to see what works live and what doesn't. Getting comfortable with the new equipment, that sort of stuff. That first gig was at the basement of the Mary Digs, but the next night we were playing a bigger stage at Fausto's. I got there pretty early. Fausto's actually had a decent menu, so I got myself a lasagna and a Coke. I was expecting a small crowd, maybe 20 people, but as more and more people started pouring in, we ended up with more than 40. About an hour before we went on stage, the place was packed. Lynn was almost foaming at the mouth as she set up the merch. We got ready, we put our game faces on, and stepped out to the pre-recorded intro notes of Concrete Baby. The sound guy had some trouble adjusting the main mic volume, so we got a nasty feedback loop straight off the bat. Not gonna lie, it just kinda added to our look. Most of the crowd thought it was part of the show. Kind of punk. When we got to Subway Maggots, I once again stood up during Cam's solo. The lights were high and dim, and the view of the crowd pulsed with the beat of the song. It was to be a short show, but our supporters showed up in full gear anyway. Gotta love them. But once again, in the back, I saw the man with the raincoat. Among all these people, jumping up and down, there he was. Those big white eyes gleaming in the spotlights, ceaseless and unblinking. I just stared at him, almost losing track of time. I lost my rhythm, causing an awkward break in the song. Rich just played it off, and it turned out pretty well in the end. Still, I can't say I didn't lose my cool. I think the guys noticed. We tried to finish on Coca-Cola Cannibal this time, but it was clear that we should stick to Waltz of the Apostate. Got a clear-cut ending. I made a mental note of it. I stayed a few seconds extra and just watched the man in the raincoat. He just stood there, far in the back, watching us. No applause, no cheers, nothing. Just those big white eyes. As we stepped off stage, Rich and Cam both came up to me. We agreed on putting Waltz of Apostate back as the finisher, but all in all, we were pretty happy. Still, there was something unsaid hanging in the air. Rich gave me a look. "Raincoat Man was in the back again," he said. "Creepy motherfucker." "If we're gonna have stalkers," Cam sighed, "the least they can do is get some fucking merch. Has he talked to you? Any of you? Have you seen him up close?" Cam leaned out of the door and peeked into the venue. "Fucker's gone," he said. "You sure?" "Hard to miss." We played our Sunday gig at Roland's the next night. It was a bit outside of town, but we still drew a bit of a crowd. Again, the guy in the raincoat showed up. Just after the show ended, Cam tried to push his way through the crowd to talk to him. Before he could get there, I saw the raincoat man slip out through a side door, pushing his way past a guard. Apparently, no one had seen him come in. It was like he just popped up. There was no paid entrance, so he could have just walked in, but no one had seen where he came from. One moment, he was just sort of there. We joked about him being our mascot, but deep down, I was unsettled. I wouldn't want to meet those big white eyes alone in an alleyway. That unblinking, ceaseless stare. Fuck no. We rehearsed most nights of the week, but Cam and I both had day jobs to deal with. It's always been a point of contention with Rich, who thought it was holding us back. To him, it was this one thing holding us from greatness. He wanted us to burn bridges, to commit fully, and to just be non-stop 24/7 heavy metal. Cam and I argued that without our jobs, we wouldn't even have any equipment. Unless we were going all in on a cappella, we needed gear. When Friday night came back around, we were ready. We went back to the basement at Mary Diggs and opened for an out-of-state black metal band. Twice the crowd. Easy. Local paper was there to cover it too. This after party was going to be insane. We were on first. I kept an eye out for the man in the raincoat, trying to see when he showed up. He wasn't there for the first song. This was a different type of venue. It actually required tickets. If he showed up, someone had to have seen him come in. You don't forget those weird eyes. Unless he was already in here to begin with, or had some kind of secret entrance. It wasn't until we got to Subway Maggot that I saw him. As we got to the first chorus and the crowd started to jump, the raincoat man was this immovable object in the back. His eyes almost shone. Living in a second-hand jacket, taught to read by a cokehead abbot. I got a good look at him. As the spotlight shone directly at him, I could see something. A strange texture on the raincoat, a weird sheen on his face. Not sweat, but something. I roamed free, bored in debris. No mouth. Just these two white orbs. Fucker barely even looked human. Was he? Was that even a raincoat? Bow down to the Subway Maggot. This time, I completely dropped the ball. As Cam's solo ended, I just stood there, lost in thought. I stared at the raincoat man, and I just had this feeling that I was seeing something wrong. Like he wasn't what he appeared. Like he wasn't real. The rest of our show went off without a hitch, but Rich was pissed. The raincoat man disappeared just after our show, before the main act even got on stage. Not that it mattered to Rich. As far as he was concerned, there was no main act. If you fuck this up, you're out, said Rich. I don't care if it's fucking Jesus in that crowd. You do your fucking part. It's that fucking... I composed my thoughts. Rich tapped his foot and bit his lip. It's the guy in the coat. I think there's something wrong with him, I continued. Wrong? What the fuck do you mean, wrong? There's something off about him, I sighed. Like there's something wrong about him. I don't care, yelled Rich. I don't fucking care. So get your head in the fucking game. He pushed past me and stormed down the hall. Cam followed suit, giving me an apologetic shrug. I stepped out into the alley to have a smoke. It was some sort of inner yard, surrounded by brick walls, at least 9 feet high. I was alone with 6 trash cans, but I could still feel the music pump from the main hall. I lit a cigarette and checked my socials. The tobacco masked the trash stench pretty well. Rich could get intense during big shows, so smoking was pretty much a requirement. But there was a strange sound. A flutter, like someone opening and closing blinds, again and again. A strange clicking noise, a kind of vibration in the air. I looked up. Standing on top of the brick wall, just behind me, was the raincoat man. But this time, I got a better look at him. The streetlights reflected off his head and shoulders. That wasn't just a plastic raincoat, but was something thick. Rubber, maybe. And the eyes. The goddamn eyes. They weren't eyes at all. They were just these white spots, like the spots on the back of a ladybug. As I watched, I could see parts of it moving. Thin, twig-like arms twitching back and forth. What I thought was strands of black hair moved like mandibles. And in the blink of an eye, the raincoat just twitched, folding outwards, then back in, like the wings of a black housefly. He vibrated, making this strange humming noise, exactly like the hum of our loudspeakers. It just burned into my head. As I stared at it, I realized it was staring back, like an animal ready to pounce. It was just waiting for an excuse. Despite that, I burst into a sprint. I dropped my phone and my cigarettes as I drove back inside, slamming the door behind me. I could hear something bash against the door and then stop. It stayed out there, skittering, scratching on the door. I could hear the hum again, right outside. I stood there for a few minutes, just trying to listen, but I could barely hear my own thoughts over the blast of the music. I didn't even notice I was crying until a teardrop hit the back of my hand. I was in complete shock, and when I realised what could have happened, I just screamed. No one heard it over the music. I tried to talk to the guys about it. I tried to bring it up, to explain it, to make sense of it, but I couldn't. I tried to convince myself that I was misremembering it, but the image was burned into my mind. The hum of the loudspeakers started to give me shivers. It was like they were calling out to it, asking it to come back and finish the job. The next day, as we were setting up an outdoor stage downtown, I thought about cancelling the whole thing. I've been looking for excuses all day, but Rich needed a win after my screw-up the previous night. Still, if I saw that thing in the audience again, I had no idea what I'd do. That thing was coming for me. It was there for a reason, and something we were doing was causing it to follow us. Maybe it was just the hum of the loudspeakers. I had no idea. That night, as we were about to go on stage, I had cold sweats. My stomach was protesting, and I was just a mess. I couldn't bear the thought of looking out and seeing it, to see it twitch closer and closer. To just go out there and know it was coming for me was just awful. I threw up minutes before we stepped up, and Rich was panicking. I'm good, I lied. I got this. We played a decent set. Shades, Blackout Summer, and Coca-Cola Cannibal were just fine. But when we got to Subway Maggot, I got nervous. That was always the time I saw him. When I stood up during that solo, I knew I'd see him. He'd be there, far off in the back, just swaying back and forth. I'd see those white spots, tricking those next to him. He was one of us. Camouflage, a predator. When you've played a song as many times as we have, you know it by heart. You can wake up hungover and beaten and still play the damn thing before you even remember your name. That was the only thing keeping me going, the automation. My heart, legs and arms are just feeling the beat. But me, mentally, I was out there in the crowd looking for the Raincoat Man. And as the chorus ended and Cam took the stage, I stood up once again, conducting the crowd with my drumsticks. There he was. I saw him in the far back, flashing images from the strobe lights, but he wasn't just standing there this time. He was feeding. I saw a dozen little twig-like arms holding a young man. His head was held back as it choked him. 1,000 little hairs were cutting him, drinking his body from 6 different angles. Mandibles biting at his head, trying to take a bite out of his scalp. Even from this distance, I saw blood and strips of flesh coming loose. A pair of panicked green eyes met my gaze. If I'd dropped the ball before, this was 10 times worse. I threw my drumsticks aside, pushed Cam out of the way, and took the mic from Rich. I pointed at the very back, screaming at the top of my lungs. Put the lights up! It's killing him! Put the fucking lights up! The audience gasped. Some screamed. But when the spotlights came on, all that was left was a victim lying in the grass, clutching his wounds. Shrieks of a wounded animal. And somewhere, far above me, I could hear the hum of a loudspeaker. The Raincoat Man was just gone, scattering to the wind like a fucking cockroach. There was police and an ambulance on site within minutes. The victim just kept screaming, and people didn't know what to do. There were bits of hair and skin all over the grass. People were escorted away, and we were asked a whole bunch of questions, me in particular. I tried to describe the Raincoat Man as if I didn't know what it looked up close, but it was hard. I wasn't giving them much to go on, but I couldn't stand there and say it was an insect. I just couldn't. Instead, I just said I saw blood and what looked like someone dressed in black. Maybe a knife. We skipped playing for the rest of the month. Once we went on tour and got away from it all, things would feel better. For a while, I couldn't even rehearse, as the hum of the loudspeaker would make my heart skip a beat. I'd get panic attacks. I could imagine it listening just outside. I even stopped listening to music at home, fearing that the vibrations might bring it back. But I'm getting paranoid. Whenever I see someone resembling that silhouette, or whenever I hear a strange sound overhead, it feels like it's coming for me. Like it stalks me, and I'm not crazy for saying that. Just last week, Cam told me he got a message from my old number. You know, the one I dropped in the alley. It was simple and short. Play more Subway Maggot. And that, well, that's why we no longer play Subway Maggot.
Look, I know it doesn't look like much, Jeanette sighed, but the Grand Noir is solid. Most of this stuff is just broken surfaces. It needs some love and a fresh coat of paints, but that's pretty much it. I don't know, I said, poking a rotten plank with my foot. I don't think the loan will cover this. We can stretch a bit, Jeanette said, leaning on me. We've got some flex money. Not enough to call it flex money, Jeannie. Stretch money, maybe. Rainy day fund. We got this, she smiled. I know we do. I wasn't convinced, and the choir of frogs outside seemed equally unimpressed. As I kicked over another plank, I noticed part of a broken sign. Something once hung in the entryway. A big red sign with yellow letters. No children, I read out loud. Are we putting that back up? Nah, some rules are meant to be broken. Fair enough. I left the sign on the floor. The Grand Noir was a few months away from a grand reopening, but Jeannie, if anyone, could make it happen. But that first moment, standing in the entryway, I couldn't feel the excitement. All I saw was a dark building, abandoned for good reason. The next few months was just a parade of burning money, but Jeannie got results. We added an extension to the front of the building so we could have an outdoor serving area. We rewired the kitchen, refurbished the upstairs guest bedrooms, installed all new wall panelling, and turned the entrance into a proper reception. The outside got a fresh coat of dark grey paint, and we even set up a guest Wi-Fi with passwords based on your booking number. The Grand Noir was shaping up to a grand reopening, and I gotta say, Jeannie did a great job. But I could never really get an explanation for that strange sign. No children. We figured that this had something to do with the spotty history of the building. Some said it used to be a smuggler's den back in the Prohibition days. Others said it was a brothel sometime in the 40s. One local swore that it was the hideaway for some former president's mistress. Either way, everyone agreed on one thing. All rumours aside, the Grand Noir used to be a bad place. No place for children. There was a lot of history hidden in that building. We kept most of it into storage space in the basement. Old books, journals, ledgers, calendars, some furniture. Things we didn't want to throw away, but had nowhere to put. We kept a few things, like a large Bible that's been left open in the master bedroom. The thing was huge, every page as long as my arm. We put it behind a plexiglass display behind the reception. After we got the place up to code, Jeannie spent a lot of time hiring the staff. We knew it'd take some time before we turned a profit, but she had some experience in the tourism industry. The area was screaming for new jobs, and tourists didn't have many options if they wanted to stay in our corner. But even before we opened, there was a lot of interest from the locals. I remember one day when I saw the Jacksons pass by the walking trail in the backyard. Mr. and Mrs. Jackson stopped by the dock to check on August, one of the local fishermen. Meanwhile, their kid Andrew just stared up at the Grand Noir. I saw him from one of the upstairs guest rooms, and he looked right at me. Not just the way kids do, but with intent. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw him open his mouth wide and scream something at the top of his lungs. Mr. and Mrs. Jackson ran over to him, picked him up, and hurried down the path. If I'd only paid attention right then and there, a lot of problems might have been avoided. There were a few hints that something about this place wasn't right. For one thing, we found not just one, but a total of 6 no children signs. There was also the staring. Some kids who were just passing by would sometimes stop and just stare at the building for no apparent reason. I didn't see or hear anyone scream the way Andrew had, but the staring was still a bit uncomfortable. At one point, as I was taking a smoke break outside, I got the chance to ask 12-year-old Hannah Lance why she and the other kids tended to stop and stare. It's strange, she answered. It's like it wants my help. On the other hand, Jeannie didn't have time to think about that sort of nonsense. She was working herself to the bone, barely keeping down her breakfast in the morning. A house is a house, she argued. It's just a building and a location. That's all there is to it. In general, I agreed with her. I didn't think there was anything magical or evil about one location more than any other, but I did believe there were things that could affect people in strange ways. There were a lot of strange little things about the people living around the Grand Noir. The Bayou can be a mysterious place, and many of the people who live there are equally mysterious. For example, we wanted to paint a mural in our bar, so we hired a local painter. He suggested the image of a young child picking flowers, as this area was known for large fields of blooming flowers. I agreed, but when the piece was finished, I noticed he'd discolored them. There was a young girl in a dress, picking a large bouquet of sunflowers, except they were blue. That's what they used to look like around here, the painter argued. These lands have history. They have rules. I got the chance to learn a little more about the history over the course of the following weeks. As we opened up both the restaurant and the bar to the public, we were still working to get the upstairs guest rooms ready for those who wanted a longer stay. We had some trouble with the pipework. That didn't stop plenty of locals from stopping by though. I remember one night, as Pop's Jerry stopped by to check out the bar. A man in his early 60s who looked like he was well past 90. He just had the face of someone who's had a rough life. I took the opportunity to ask him about the area and what he'd heard of the Grand Noir. It was an overall pleasant conversation. We compared some notes, talked about the various rumours and shared a drink. Jeannie was back in the kitchen, double-checking the shrimp delivery. But as soon as I mentioned the no children signs, Pop's Jerry started looking concerned. Yeah, I've heard about that, sighed Pops. Yeah, I've heard all about that. You got any idea what it means? All these rumours have one thing in common, he nodded. None of them was a place for children. It's like it was written into the, law of the land. The Grand Noir can be successful in all kinds of ways, but the deal is just to keep the kids out of it. I thought a lot about that. Whether it was a brothel, a smuggler's hideout, or a mansion for a mistress, it was never meant to shelter children. We were sort of breaking that rule, opening a B&B. We knew there'd be families with children who wanted to stop by, but could that really be all there was to it? There was this worry that started to gnaw at me, a worry that we were breaking some sort of covenant. I asked Jeannie if we could keep a few signs up as a sort of joke, but she saw right through me. There's no deceiving that woman, and I was an idiot for trying. I get you that you're worried, she sighed as she held me tight. This can't fail, and you're worried. I'm worried too. It's not just a worry, I explained. I think there's something to it. I've seen the way people look at this place. And by people, you mean kids. Yeah, kids. And the kids were becoming an increasing problem. The first couple who came to stay in one of our guest rooms had a 3-year-old son who absolutely refused to step inside. He screamed, cried, and even as he was carried inside, he kept flailing wildly. The parents excused themselves 1,000 times, but I could still hear him screaming hours later. They ended up leaving just before midnight, as it was impossible for him to calm down. They just took him out to the car and left. They still paid, but I couldn't imagine them coming back anytime soon. Every now and then, I'd see kids from the neighbourhood just stop and stare up at the building, sometimes one at a time, sometimes in groups. I once caught the Jackson kid trying to sneak in through the kitchen door. When I confronted him about it, it was like he snapped out of a trance. He was genuinely scared and had no idea where he even was. He begged me not to tell his parents. Apparently, they'd forbidden him from going anywhere near the Grand Noir. We got more guests over the following weeks. Mostly fishing enthusiasts, but also a few couples who wanted to experience this side of the bayou. Hell, one family was just obsessed with alligators and came to see a nearby farm. There were a few minor incidents. Kids who woke up screaming in the middle of the night, or came to the reception to ask weird questions. Things like, what do the lights want? And, can you turn off the gargling? One time, there was a kid who called the reception, but all he did was breathe into the phone. It was clear to me that something was affecting them, but I couldn't tell what it was. Then came the morning of August 5th. We'd had a pretty rough storm the prior night, so a lot of the backyard furniture was in disarray. I had to use a chainsaw to split a fallen tree. I spent most of the morning just putting everything back. With water leaking into my old shoes, I was surprisingly cold. You usually can't see your own breath in early August, so you can imagine my surprise when I saw that white cloud leaving me. Then I heard a loud crash. Furniture falling all over, something breaking. The second-story window was open, and something was splayed out on our broken plastic furniture. For a moment, I didn't even realize what it was. It just looked like a pile of clothes thrown to the wind. Then, as I heard the screams from the second floor, it dawned on me. It was a kid. She jumped. Apart from a broken shoulder, she was fine. She had no recollection of why she'd jumped out the window, and no idea how she'd even done it. Jeanette promised to make sure the windows couldn't be opened, but it felt like fixing symptoms rather than a disease. There was still something about this place that just refused to allow children. While Jeannie was looking at the practical side of things, I was still convinced there was something about this place we didn't know about. So I started going through history to a greater extent. I knew there were books, journals, and other documentation dating all the way back to the late 19th century. I put some of those away myself when we first cleaned the place up. I gathered all the journals, diaries, and ledgers I could find. But it would prove increasingly difficult to get time to read them. Not only did we get a lot more guests to cater to, but there was also more activity overall. Jeannie needed all hands on deck, so I only got the time to read just before bed. Jeannie tried her best to just keep everything afloat, acting like the accident had never happened. She did fix the windows, though. One night, as I laid awake peering over an important ledger, Jeannie turned to me. She could barely stay awake, but my reading lamp burned her eyes open. "Sorry," I said, angling the lamp away. "Just gonna finish this." "What are you looking at?" she asked, cuddling up next to me. "Really? What do you think is in here?" "No idea," I sighed. "I don't think whatever happened here is the kind of thing you put in ledgers. But you think something happened?" "I suppose so, yeah," I nodded. "I think something sort of stays." "Stay?" she smiled. "Something stays?" "I don't know," I shrugged, putting the ledger aside for the night. "I just want to know." As I stretched to turn off the light, I heard something shift. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved. I held my breath, listening. "Come on," groaned Jeannie. "I'm tired." "Hold on." I got out of bed. I could hear something. I took a sudden step and could hear something shift and rattle. Something reacted. Jeannie sat up as well. She could hear it too. I put a finger to my lips and checked the wardrobe. Nothing. Same with the hallway. I thought about checking under the bed, but it was a bit too tight for a person to fit under there. Not a small person, though. Like a kid. I got down on all fours, brushed the covers aside, and fell backwards. 6 eyes looked out at me. The Jackson kid and 2 of his friends. Their mouths were wide open, their eyes unblinking. As I screamed in surprise, they screamed right back. A strange guttural sound, like something tried to clear sand from the back of their throat. I'll never forget the look he gave me. At that moment, he wasn't a kid. He was an intruder, and there was no telling what he might do. Hollow eyes and instinctual malice. If there'd been a weapon, he would have attacked me, I'm sure of it. I just held my breath as my heartbeat raced. Jeannie called the police. Once again, sirens and flashing lights came to the Grand Noir. We didn't press charges, but the officers had a stern discussion with the parents. But one major thing changed. Jeannie accepted that there was something we couldn't control about this place. She couldn't keep pretending like it was all fine or something passing. The incidents were getting more common and more bizarre. One night, as I was going through what looked like an old cookbook, I noticed 3 kids running across the backyard. One of them held a lit torch. As Jeannie called out to them, they just ran away laughing. I'd also seen the Jackson kid again. He'd been sitting in the car across the street, waiting for his dad to pick something up, and I could see something shift in his eyes. He went from completely disinterested to obsessed in the blink of an eye. I saw him pounding on the window, screaming at the top of his lungs, and the colour drained from his eyes. They barely even looked like eyes anymore. They were more like black holes in the middle of his face. One morning, as I was opening up the reception, I saw 4 of them standing in the driveway outside. I hurried outside to scare them away, but I stopped as soon as I opened the door. They had that hollow stare, but with a sinister smile. Something was off. They weren't running away. "What do you want?" I called out, still rubbing the sleep out of my eyes. "Just tell us what you want." They just stood there, grinning. The youngest was probably about 6 years old, the oldest closer to 14. I was about to walk up to them when I stopped myself to check my surroundings. Good thing I did. They'd covered the driveway with broken glass. It could have gone straight through the broken sole of my old shoes. When they noticed I'd seen through their plan, they just took off. I just stood there, trying to calm myself down. This was getting dangerous. I could have hurt myself badly. I was getting paranoid. Over the next few days, I could feel my pulse racing by just seeing someone walking up the driveway or hearing someone walking upstairs. I'd imagine myself seeing someone in the corner of my eye, and even creaking plank was like announcing a potential intruder. I just felt unsafe, and I couldn't even appreciate how well we were doing. The Grand Noir was a success. The location was spot on. There were no options if you wanted a place to stay in the area, and there were plenty of activities for all kinds of tourists. The only problem was when people brought kids. It got to the point where Jeannie was starting to pretend that the family rooms were booked, even though they weren't. It wasn't official, but we were both starting to feel the same thing. There really should be no children at the Grand Noir. One night, as I was going through the journal of one of the old groundskeepers, I suddenly just stopped. There it was, ink on paper, clear as day. No children. It was the first time I'd seen it referenced in the books. I double-checked the entry, reading through it carefully. While not saying it outright, the groundskeeper seemed to imply there was some sort of prostitution going on. There were talks of the girls, and Madame, and several patrons. The groundskeeper seemed to think it was a waste of time landscaping for these kinds of people. It was implied that the place was a smashing success, and that guests were coming from out of state just to spend the night. When he spoke of no children, he was referencing a rule that the Madame had set. If you were a child, you had to leave the Grand Noir. There was to be no children born at the Grand Noir. That was it. We hadn't seen the complete picture, the complete rule set. No children born at the Grand Noir. I thought about it and came to an uncomfortable conclusion. I should have seen the signs, but I guess we'd just been too busy. Why hadn't she told me? Was it too early? Book in hand, I hurried up the stairs. As I stepped into the reception, I stopped like a deer in headlights. At least a dozen kids of various ages, all spread throughout the reception. One of the older ones had a shovel, while most of the younger ones had knives, forks, or hammers. They were armed, and they were waiting for me. Some sort of prey instinct kicked in, forcing me to stand completely still. There was no way for me to get past them without getting cut. My skin tingled. I held my breath and counted my heartbeats. I could taste sweat, and my mouth was getting salty. I almost lost my balance just from trying too hard to stand still. Taking a single step forward, they all shifted in unison. One of the kids in the back groaned with that strange guttural sound. Apart from that, it was dead quiet. Not a single footstep, not a breath out of place. Just a few frogs singing from the bayou. But I couldn't just stand there. My heartbeats echoed in my head, making my neck twitch. I had to try something. My eyes, darting back and forth, made a mental note of the way I could run to get out. A way for me to get by with as little chance of getting cut as possible. I'd have to pass 3 of them, but they were small and I was fast. But still, I counted down from 3, took a deep breath, and burst into a sprint. There was an explosion of movement. Plants getting knocked over, someone tripping on the carpet, screams, laughter, metal scraping against the wallpaper. It took me just a few steps to realise there was no way for me to get out. I had to make a break for the top floor. Turning on a heel, I felt something sharp snip the heel of my shoe. One kid took a swing at me with a knife, but only scratched my jeans. Another tried to stick a fork in me, but their arms were too short. A fourth had some kind of fire poker and took a wide swing at my legs. I had expected a stab. I took a whack to my right leg and fell forward, despite having the air knocked out of my lungs and a burning pain in my leg. I hurried up the stairs. I was hobbling forward, barely able to place any weight on my wounded leg. I'd been hit harder than I thought, and I suspected there was a fracture. I got upstairs with all the kids in tow. I figured Jeannie would be in our bedroom, so I took a sharp right. I burst through the door, locked it behind me, and backed away towards the window. No Jeannie. She was somewhere else. Somewhere safe, I hoped. I fumbled for my phone and called her. It took 2 rings before she picked up. There was a pounding on the door, and someone was trying to twist the old lock using a knife. "What's going on?" Jeannie called out. "What's that noise?" "I'm upstairs," I answered. There's a dozen of them. God, my damn leg." "I'm coming," she yelled back. "Just hold on." "No, Jeannie, you gotta go," I said. "You can't be here. Not right now. You can't." "What are you talking about? I'm in the garden. Jeannie, please." The lock was snapping back and forth. They were gonna get through. "Trust me on this, please. Just go. Get back to town." "I can't please, Jeannie." As the door slammed open, I saw dozens of little black eyes staring at me, gleefully smiling, armed and ready. Maybe this was punishment for breaking some sacred rule. Maybe there could be no children at the Grand Noir. Maybe these lands have traditions so old that the ground itself remembers them. Either way, I had to try to get out. I pulled on the window, but Jeannie had fixed it. The windows could no longer be opened without a key, and Jeannie had the keys. I was cornered. They started circling me like sharks. Their feet were so small and light, barely even touching the carpet. Some of the younger ones seemed to float, just half an inch off the ground. I could hear the clatter of blades touching as they stood close enough for their hands to touch. "He brought a child to the Grand Noir," one of them whispered. "The Grand Noir brings the children back," whispered another. "So lost, forgotten." I could barely hear them over the pounding in my chest. I didn't even feel my fractured leg. My adrenaline was spiking. I thought about where to go, what to do, but there were no answers. It was hopeless. One wrong step, and I'd be cut down. From behind, I heard one more voice. This one came from no child. It was a dark whisper from a grown woman with a thick accent. "Breaking the rules breaks the man." I felt a slash across my shoulder. It took me half a second for the pain to reach my mind, but once it did, I fell to my knees screaming. They all stepped forward. Hammers, knives, shovels. Everything they could grab, all pointed at me. Raised laughter. Then they stopped. My phone was ringing. 1 ring and they all just stopped. 2 rings and one in the back started to move away. After 3 rings, they were all hurrying to get away and out, almost climbing over one another to get out of the room. By the 4th ring, it was pandemonium. By the 5th ring, the room was empty. I could hear the clattering of dropped weapons tumbled down the stairs. I just sat there, bleeding. It turns out, Jeannie had been pregnant for some time. She called me from downtown just to make sure I was okay. She'd done as I asked and left the Grand Noir as fast as she could. With her out of the picture, there was no need for vengeance. The rules had been upheld, and so the punishment was postponed. No children were to be born in the Grand Noir. I talked to Jeannie about it, and we decided we'd move to a different location. We'd still be the owners, but we'd hire a general manager. In a few years, we think we'll be turning a profit. Until then, well, we both have jobs to go back to and a family that will support us. And the Grand Noir will still be there. Maybe we can come back someday. Maybe not. From what I've heard, everything just seemed to sort itself out once Jeannie and I left. The Grand Noir wasn't calling to anyone. It seemed to just react to pregnant women, not kids themselves. But now, as I write this, I have a worry that just won't quit nagging me. I'm fairly sure that our child was conceived at the Grand Noir. If that's the case, will that in any way affect them? Even if we left, and even if they're born somewhere else, can the Grand Noir let that happen? I'm wondering, because even though we're far away from the bayou, I can see that twinkle in the eyes of children. I can see the smiles creeping back on their faces. How far does the no children born rule really stretch? Should I be worried?